So a lot of people have been asking me about Kinraide, and since I'm driving home and very tired, and I have 11 and a half hours to go, 817 miles, and I don't sit still any other time, I guess it'd be a good time to talk about who he was and maybe shed some light on what this whole trip was about. His story reads like science fiction. And to be honest, I think if you looked at any of us collectors, or all of our lives are a bit like that. And sorry for the rain, but it's really shitty weather here. It's raining and snowing, and the roads are wet, and it's foggy, and it's just nasty out. But fortunately, there's not much traffic. So I'm incidentally in Virginia, near Norfolk, I think. I don't know. Driving south on I-95. But Kinraide, yeah. So it was about 1995 when my mentor, I got a book from one of my mentors. So I have two mentors, Jim Hardesty and Bill Wysock. And they were on opposite ends of the country. Jim Hardesty was in Ithaca, New York, and Bill was in outside of Los Angeles in a place called Monrovia. And Jim had a company, PV Scientific, and he sold static machines and induction coils and Crookes tubes and crystal radios, and he also reprinted books. And so I bought a bunch of books from him, and the first one that really got my attention was called High Frequency Currents by Frederick Finch Strong. And it was an unusual book because this guy appeared to be kind of like the father of I hate to say quackery, but just using the term broadly that most people know this stuff as. He was the inventor of the glass electrode, later found in the violet ray machines. And what he really did was he pioneered the use of high frequency currents in therapeutics in the US. So we know in France there were people like Arsène d'Arsenval and Paul Houdin who did this similar things, but Strong actually brought the first machine to market called the Strong Ovington machine. It was made around 1898, somewhere around there. He enlisted the help of Earl Louis Ovington, who later became the first U.S. airmail pilot and who worked for Thomas Edison. And he's also the gentleman who built the Griffith Observatory Tesla coil. But in any case, all of what I'm about to say is happening before that. So Strong, in his book, first of all, he documented something very interesting, because the book was from 1908, and he documented the history of high frequency currents when they really weren't around very long. And the reason he did this was to give himself credit in history and give credit to his colleagues and even his competitors at that time, because I think he probably knew that this information would be lost in time. And he was absolutely right. And had he not written these chapters of his book, no one would know anything about a great majority of these companies. And in his book, he mentioned kind of how he was inspired to start working with X-rays. And he mentioned visiting the house of T.B. Kinraide in Jamaica Plain. And he said that at the time, when people were more or less struggling to x-ray the soft tissues like the hands, he witnessed whole live human skeletons at Kinraide's house. And that struck a nerve with me, and I became really interested who this guy Kinraide was. And they had a photograph of one of his machines, and it was unlike anything I've ever seen previously in any books or reference or eBay or anything like that. So I became really interested in this guy Kinraide, and I bought every x-ray book that I could find, hoping to get some clues as to who this gentleman was. And almost universally there was nothing. At most, after maybe 10 years, I found a few sentences written about him. And as my story goes, equally peculiar as Mr. Kinraide's, I built a replica of one of his machines because I was interested in this flat spiral type of Tesla coil that we call pancake coils now. And I kind of resurrected this technology. It started off 2001 in September, really working with this style of coil. And I made a very crude replica of one of his x-ray machines, and it worked. And I ended up donating that prototype to Narodny Technical Museum in Prague. It was a national technical museum there. And that's a whole other story. But that night, I had a dream. And in real life, I was contemplating opening a coffee shop. And it was something that it was floating around for many years. This idea of having a coffee shop filled with eccentric antiques. And in the dream, I was on a bus going to Boston, and there were two teenage girls giggling in the seat in front of me. And nothing much about the dream was that memorable, except that all of a sudden, the girls turned around and said, "Hey, you like coffee. You should go to the June Bug." And I woke up at like 2 a.m. And that sentence was in my head. And I went to the computer, and this was long before Google. I think it was Yahoo or something like that. I looked up June Bug and coffee, wondering what the connection was. And up came search results for June Bug Cafe on Center Street in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. And I thought that was really interesting because June Bug is not a name that's typically in my head, though I remember for some reason there was a small film or something I saw as a child where June bugs were mentioned, and I hadn't thought about that word since. You know, this was 20 years later or something like that. And I wanted to go to Boston because I thought maybe that's a clue. Maybe it's a sign I need to go there and look for Kinraide's stuff. And at the time, my ex-wife said, "No, you're fucking crazy. Forget about it." But I kept thinking about it. And I built another one of his replicas. This was months and months later. And I was hoping to have another weird dream. And I didn't. No dream at all. I didn't, or if I did, I didn't remember them. But the next day, I got a very strange phone call out of the blue from a man named Gerald Zeitlin. And Gerald was an anesthesiologist historian. And he called me standing in front of the grave of William James Morton in Forest Hills Cemetery. And when I heard the name Forest Hills, I knew immediately he was in Jamaica Plain. And Morton was kind of a colleague of Kinraide. They knew each other. They were both in the same industry, let's say, of early X-ray work. Both very prominent figures. And he was actually asking about something that was written on the tomb of William James Morton. He said, it said he discovered high-frequency currents. And Gerald knew that was really Tesla, and he was asking what I knew about that. And it gets convoluted because, of course, there were many people developing or on the path of developing high-frequency coils at the time. And Morton wasn't one of them. He wasn't developing coils, but he was working with static machines and Leyden jars, and he came up with a type of interrupted current that kind of mimicked high frequency, but it didn't really have the same properties. But he wanted to take credit for it because he did have some priority over Tesla, at least in that aspect of work, even though it wasn't exactly the same thing. And of course, we know Elihu Thomson published air core coils.
Welcome to North Carolina.
I'm in North Carolina now. So anyway, it gets convoluted, all these stories. But in any case, that was my sign to say, fuck it, I gotta go to Boston, because it's very weird that I had two references to Jamaica Plain, both after trying to replicate some of Kinraide's work. And I booked a ticket to Boston, and not knowing if I would find anything. And during that course of time, I started working on another one of his inventions, which was a type of spark gap. And the next day, no phone call, no weird dreams, but one of the saved searches on eBay popped up in my emails that Kinraide suddenly showed up. And of course, with eBay, if you search for something, you can have them email you if anyone lists something. And all of a sudden, one of his patents was for sale in the UK. And it had a buy it now option, so I bought the patent, not expecting I'd get it in time, but it arrived in about 2 weeks from England. And when you file a patent, back then, I mean, it may be the same now. When you're in the U.S. and you file a patent, you just put typically the county you're from. And when you're an American filing a patent in England, you actually start off with your address. So the first line of this patent was I, Thomas Burton Kinraide, of 38 Spring Park Avenue, Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. I had his address. And I looked up the address, and there was an Eclipse Realty with the name Stephen Williams. And I found the phone number, and I called the number and apologized for asking a very weird question to this gentleman, and said, sorry, but I'm researching a guy named Kinraide, and the address of your house came up, and I wondered if you knew who he was, or if your house was from this Victorian time period. And he said, yes, absolutely, Kinraide built my house, and it's a legend in town, and nobody really knows who he was. And so I asked him, can I visit your house? It happens to be I'm coming to Boston. And he said, absolutely. And so I went to Boston, and I was expecting a house, and instead there was this 25-room mansion, and it looked like something out of Scooby-Doo from the road. It was enormous. And I called Stephen to get inside, and he had an emergency. His daughter had an emergency, and he was out of town. And he was kind enough to have a handyman let me in the house to explore. And I started exploring the basement of the house first. And one of the things I noticed in the basement was this very peculiar, what looked like a small closet door. And so instinctively, that's the first place I wanted to explore. And that was the entranceway to a lot of hidden rooms underneath the porches of the house, where all of Kinraide's experiments were still, and also including the things that Frederick Strong wrote about in his book, Witnessing in His House. So that's what started it all. But who is this Kinraide character? So a lot has transpired over the last 30 years. And family of his have come out of the woodwork, and in very strange ways, I ended up with kind of his life story coming to me in bits and pieces. And a guy that we had just sentences about years ago ended up being thousands of pages worth of information. And so Kinraide emigrated to the U.S. from Canada, from New Brunswick. And originally his family was from Isle of Man. And he came to the U.S. and he worked a short time for Waltham Watch. And he also worked at the Biltmore Hotel. And I've heard two variations of this story, but one was that he was at the Biltmore Hotel and a very wealthy family came in, and as he took their suitcases, they said that he was the reincarnation of their son. The other side of the story that I heard was that he had ventured off the Jamaica Plain and became very thirsty and needed a glass of water, so he stopped at this large house and asked for a drink. And the people there saw him, and same ending of the story, they thought he was the reincarnation of their son. And these people were the Reed family, and they owned a very large section of land in Jamaica Plain. And the Reeds were of the company Tiffany and Reed from Paris. And Tiffany and Reed was the original Tiffany company, the Tiffany Jewelry Company. So they were extremely wealthy. And Mrs. Reed, Rebecca Reed was her name, she had, her elderly husband his health was failing. And she had offered Mr. Kinraide $20,000 to take care of them, like a male nurse. And Kinraide, of course, jumped on the opportunity because that was a lot of money back then. And he built this house at 38 Spring Park Avenue. And as the rumor goes, he had blasted the foundation of the house with dynamite because it's on a large rock bed there. And he broke all the neighbors' windows doing so. And that's very true because of the structure of the house and the rooms. It's very cave-like underneath those porches and the rooms that I found. And there's a hidden ballroom in the house that's the entire walls around it were blasted out, irregular shaped, not concrete, but rock formations. And Kinraide built this very mysterious, large house. And the story gets much, much stranger because when he first came to the U.S., he visited Philadelphia, and he met a man named John Worrell Keeley. And Keeley was rather famous for, in the 1875, he puts out a press release saying that he's discovered a new energy form that will replace steam power. And I have one of the original newspapers with that article. And as the years went on, that new force that he discovered was going to replace not only steam, but hydraulics, pneumatics, and later on electricity. And the man never made a single product, but he would have these seances in his lab where he demonstrated all sorts of really bizarre phenomena. And he had very clever apparatus, but he claimed that all of them were run by this mysterious force that only he understood. and he sold $5 stock certificates. And his company became very wealthy doing that. And this part of the story comes much later on. But while Kinraide was in Philadelphia, he met a woman he fell in love with who was much older than him, and her name was Rachel. And Rachel, depending on which side of the family you asked, either ran a boarding house or a whorehouse. And there's more evidence for the latter. In any case, he took her and her daughter under his wing, and they lived at this mansion that he built in Jamaica Plain. Now, the house he referred to as Ravenscroft, and it had a large stuffed raven inside. And the house was very well equipped. It had a full machine shop, a chemistry lab, a dark room, and hidden rooms where he did his experiments. And one of the interesting features was there was a large ballroom completely hidden from the rest of the house, that if you turned on a switch on the wall, it would release a mechanism that let the door, which was actually a false wall, swing upward to reveal a spiral staircase, completely lined in mahogany. And this led to a secret ballroom, and there was a room off to the side with a safe. And it also led to the basement, in the garage area of the house, where these hidden rooms were. And Kinraide also had a summer home in Cape Cod called the Hermitage on Spectacle Pond. And that home burnt to the ground sometime in the late 30s, I believe. And the story goes that an aircraft was going to crash and jettisoned its fuel overhead, and it caught on fire, and the house burned to the ground. Later, I think they disproved that it was something else that caused the fire. But in any case, this was after Kinraide died. The family members who have passed away since have told me as kids they remember playing in that house. But as far as Ravenscroft goes, Kinraide was x-raying people in the house with his new invention, which was the Kinraide coil. And as it happens, Kinraide was always interested in electricity. And he was, like Tesla, trying to work on a way of generating sparks using less wire. He kept burning up induction coils, trying to get bigger and bigger voltages out of them. And he ended up developing this flat spiral, dry insulation transformer, like an impulse transformer. It was a high-frequency transformer of sorts. And simultaneously, Röntgen discovered the X-ray. And so all of these experiments that Kinraide was doing with high voltage, suddenly this machine that he designed for making sparks would be really appealing to make X-rays as well. And so he was in the right place at the right time, and it wasn't the first X-ray machine to come on the market in the US, but it was the first really practical one in that it didn't use oil insulation and it wasn't messy, and it was fairly easy to use. The spark gap tricked a lot of people, but that's getting into the technical aspects. Hundreds and hundreds of these machines sold. Kinraide made $20,000 a year from the reeds, and he made over $5,000 a year selling these X-ray machines. Now this was in 1905. That figure of $5,000. Now, originally he sold the machines for around $230, but after a year of making them, he sold so many of them, he made enough royalties that it paid for all of the expensive molds to be able to make the ebonite parts to that machine, which was the most expensive part. And he cut the price of the machine in half so that the medical profession could benefit from having x-rays rather than him benefit from getting the royalties, which was something rather unheard of at that time period. During the course of his x-ray experiments, he accidentally burned Rachel's daughter, Ethel. And at the time, there was quite a lot of talk in the press because this wasn't just unique to Kinraide. It happened to a few people. And Rachel said, well, we don't know if she's going to live or die from this, so marry one of us or we'll sue you. And Kinraide wanted to have kids, and Rachel evidently had an illegal operation, what they referred to as an illegal operation at the time, which evidently was just having her tubes tied so that she couldn't get pregnant, which also leads to kind of more logically what her profession might have been. But in any case, Kinraide wanted to have kids. So at 40 years old, he married the 16-year-old daughter, which was very strange. And he and the daughter and the mother, who was in her 60s, much older than Kinraide at the time, they all three went on the honeymoon, and the honeymoon was in Savannah, Georgia. Now, in Savannah, Georgia, Kinraide met several prominent physicians there that also happened to be 33rd degree Masons, as Kinraide was. Kinraide was a 33rd degree Mason for the Joseph Webb Lodge in Jamaica Plain. And in Savannah, he met Eugene Corson and Richard Joseph Nunn. And Nunn was a Civil War physician who was a 33rd degree Mason there. Corson was a local physician that took up x-rays, and he was mainly treating the poor blacks in the area. And he also was one of the first people to document carpal tunnel syndrome by studying the complicated workings of the bones of the hand and wrist, which there are very many. And he ended up having to have many fingers amputated because he burned himself severely in x-raying his hand repeatedly over and over again. But in any case, they were both using Kinraide coils in Georgia as one of the first types of x-ray machines brought to that state. Kinraide, something happened December, I think it was around December, maybe a few months sooner. John Worrell Keeley became gravely ill, and there was a lot of pressure to reveal the secrets of his so-called new energy force because a lot of people invested money in it. The company was worth something like $5 million. And so on Keeley's deathbed, he said, the only one who can complete my work is Kinraide. And so what a great shock to Kinraide. He's in the middle of doing his x-ray research, really important research at the time, because it was the earliest days of the discovery, and that time was crucial in order to establish markets and that sort of thing. And so he ended up having to go to Philadelphia and dismantle Keeley's equipment, and he brought it all to Boston. And it was evident that Kinraide found evidences of fraud while he was disassembling the equipment. And he tried to cover up that fraud. But some people broke into Keeley's lab and saw what looked like evidence concealed of hidden tubings and hoses and that sort of thing. But in any case, that information doesn't surface until later. And Kinraide set up the Keeley motor at his house, and he demonstrated it for investors on the promise that they would quietly leave and accept their loss, because he didn't want to give his friend a bad name. Not even Keeley's wife knew he was a fraud. And for him to pull that off for so many years, 1875 to 1898 or so, I mean, the guy was a genius. I mean, and not quite to defend him, but he never used the money to do anything else than propagate his own bullshit story. So he was making all sorts of these strange Rube Goldberg type of devices that would cut metal or show enormous hydraulic pressures, this sort of thing. I mean, it was just none of the mechanism that he was describing to anyone was true. It was all using, of course, standard physics. And the stories around him get very interesting. But in any case, one of the people went to the press and said, all right, Kinraide demonstrated it's a fraud. And so worldwide attention looking on Kinraide. And of course, he didn't want to be the one to give his friend a bad name, so he denied it all. And he basically said, look, this thing's taken up too much of my time. It's been a great inconvenience. I have said no such thing, and I don't want anything to do with this anymore. And as the story goes, he packed up everything and crated it away. We don't know what really happened to it all. One of the machines ended up at Franklin Institute, an earlier version of the Keeley motor, which I don't think Kinraide actually had it in his possession at all. And after some prying and prodding, they admitted to me that they basically lent out the motor indefinitely to someone for a large sum of money. So they basically sold it when no one was looking. Which is a pity, because at least if they had done some sort of analysis of it, they could have shown evidence that, hey, this guy's work was completely fraudulent. But they didn't. In any case, back to Kinraide. So Kinraide had many hobbies, including he was theorizing fourth dimensional space. And he wrote some papers on 4D space that included drawings of tesseracts, which if you look up fourth dimensional space, you can see exactly the same type of things that he was drawing. And he was using mirrors and geometry to try and visualize what 4D space would look like. And he wasn't the only one. I think one of the early electrical magazines brought up the idea of, hey, what do you guys think this stuff is? And he became very obsessed and fascinated with that topic. In addition to that, I know from the family that he started making his own perfume. And on this trip, I found a mason jar of something that looked like intestines or worms or something disgusting. Had no idea what was in it. I opened the jar and it smelled absolutely incredible. And it was actually some of these preserved flowers of some kind that he was using to make perfume. And I was shocked that more than 120 years later that this stuff actually smelled fragrant and incredible. And that it was still there, and it didn't have a very good seal. It was just the glass bottom of the lid against the glass top with a spring tension of the piece of steel that holds the lid down in place. Rather remarkable, and I guess he preserved flowers in some sort of wax mixture, but it's something we're going to have to look into as we have some of the originals out of the blue. Kinraide was very eccentric. He liked hunting, he liked fishing, he was very avid in outdoor life, and he criticized his kids maybe for wanting to be inside and read books and stuff. He's like, no, get out and be physical and do some activities. And during his separation, which is a very elaborate story, he also enjoyed marrow bones and eating foods that were not quite of the typical elite's palate in Boston. And he in the course of events, it's interesting. He was a walking philanthropist, according to many people, and so he would donate scientific magazines to the local jails, for example, which was a noble thing to do at that time. he was friendly with everyone. He would offer alcohol to everyone, and it came out in the separation that even the debt collectors and tax collectors would say he's the only one that actually welcomed us into our homes, and he'd even pour us drinks. Like, it was unheard of back then. And there's stories of him being a rum runner during Prohibition, and there's a rumor that there's actually a tunnel in between his house and the neighbor's house where he would bring booze to the mayor during Prohibition, who lived next door. And we did try to find those on this trip, and I couldn't find it. And unfortunately, the interior of the house is getting completely demolished, but maybe it'll show up, maybe it won't. It's hard to tell. The neighbor was extremely cooperative, and he approached me about looking in his basement, trying to find any evidence of a hidden door and room, and we found something that was rather convincing. But the rock wall foundation in these basements are 14 inches thick, so it's not something that you want to make a mistake on if you start tearing up a wall and realizing, oh no, it's the wrong spot or something like that. It just, it's we're gonna look towards science to give us a little bit positive confirmation of where this tunnel might be. But in any case, Kinraides, they were very wealthy. He had several kids: Robert Burton Kinraide, Thomas Reed Kinraide, Ethel Leona Kinraide, and Cecil Kinraide. I've met the grandsons. One of the grandsons, Thomas Bassett Kinraide, who was Thomas Reed Kinraide's son, and daughter Pamela Sage. Very nice people, very kind to me. I've met some distant relatives. Don and Beverly, they were on, I believe, his Kinraide's mother's side. But very remotely, some people in Canada still. Almost everyone has welcomed me into the whole picture there. The exception, and she was still very nice to me, was the descendant of the next marriage of Kinraide's ex-wife, Ethel. And in the separation papers, it was called the most sensational separation in Massachusetts history, because Ethel went to the papers and basically said that Kinraide was having an affair with her mother since their honeymoon. And the Boston public, especially Cape Cod area, was not ready for that kind of story to be front page news. And it was made very amusing and complicated by the fact that Rachel didn't deny anything and was very bold about all the things that they did together. And none of the witnesses in the courtroom was prepared to hear any of that, because that was very taboo at that time period. So it was very interesting. And Kinraide, being a 33rd degree Mason, he was part of the Williams Club, which was an elite group of Masons there in Boston, and the family actually gave me original photos of him with them. He basically fled town after that. This was 1920, and just because of it was too much, the publicity and all that, and he had a separation from his wife, and so she ended up with the kids, and he ended up fleeing to California. And the only thing I can imagine that makes sense out there was that all of those early pioneers ended up in California, including Frederick Strong and Earl Ovington. And so I think he was starting life again out there. And there's nothing much of him mentioned during that time period, though we know his cause of death was from a major heart attack angina pectoris, and he had major chest pain, and he had 3 vials of radium in his coat pocket worth $80,000 when he died, which may have contributed to his death. And the family got hold of this radium, and they ended up donating it to the government because they didn't know what else to do with it. And $80,000 in 1927 was a hell of a lot of money. And also, radium was very hard to isolate back then. So nobody knows quite how he obtained this. But also, people didn't know why. But until this year, I have an idea, and that was the company that sold his coils was Sweat and Lewis in Boston. And Frank H. Sweat was the main salesman in that company. And he ended up being absorbed into Victor during a large X-ray merger in 1905 or 1906. Later, Victor became GE. And so Frank Sweat was a very prominent member of the X-ray community and very much loved. And because all of these pioneers were suffering from complications due to the X-ray, Kinraide and Tesla both got lucky on that aspect. Frank Sweat, it was said that more radium was used to try and save his life than in any other case in human history. And he died shortly after Kinraide did, so the only thing that kind of makes sense there is that Kinraide got that radium to save his friend's life. And Kinraide would have been that type of person because he cared very much about the people that helped him out. And of course, Sweat and Lewis, they were actually relatives through marriage. Lewis was the brother-in-law of Frank Sweat. They basically were the ones to put Kinraide's patents and machines to market and make him famous back during those time periods. Now, other things we learned, he was an avid photographer of electricity, and there was a famous article in Century Magazine, July 1902, Curious Electrical Forms. And I found crates of glass plate negatives under the house back in 2004, and including some of the originals that are in that article. And I just found out in recent years that Kinraide also, he made fluoroscopes also, which we knew. But what I didn't know is that he sold fluoroscope screens to Nikola Tesla to be used in his experiments. And at one point in time, there's a letter between Kinraide and Robert Underwood Johnson thanking Johnson for the invitation to meet Mr. Tesla and what an esteemed person he was, and what an honor it was to meet him. So at some point, Tesla saw the glass plate negatives, as that was what was in the article, and he also referred Kinraide to Lord Armstrong's work, asking if he knew about it. And Kinraide didn't. And Kinraide remarked that he went to the local library and found a copy of Electric Movement in Air and Water, which was the very famous book by Lord Armstrong, published in England. And he was able to find a copy, and he realized that Armstrong was doing very similar work to him. They were both completely independent of each other doing this work. And it was, both people's work was unique and different, where it wasn't just like they were both doing exactly the same thing. But very interesting history. That's kind of the short version of who Kinraide was.